Welcome back to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and I'm joined with Joanna Baron of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, my co-author in our new book, Pandemic Panic, documenting the civil rights legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic and government responses. Now, Joanna, the way we broke this book out into chapters was each chapter deals with a different fundamental freedom or constitutionally protected right. We do have some chapters dealing with very specific issues related to the pandemic, like the convoy, the Emergencies Act, and vaccines, as well as democratic rights. But let's talk about some of these different rights and how they are implicated. Let's start with freedom of movement, which is protected under our charter in Section 6. It's the right to enter, remain in, and leave Canada, and to travel within Canada. So, how were those rights, the rights to mobility, to free movement, how were they implicated by government responses to the pandemic?
So this was actually one of the major areas that we saw pretty brazenly and obviously unconstitutional action taken by governments. So in April of 2020, the maritime provinces imposed interprovincial travel bans. And so we tell the story in the book of Kim Taylor, who was a woman who lived in Nova Scotia, who unfortunately had her mother pass away, not from COVID, but during the first wave of the pandemic. And understandably, she wanted to go to her mother's funeral. And so she arranged an Airbnb, she arranged a quarantine plan, she arranged for food to be dropped off, all within a time period so that she could attend her mother's funeral. And she had to apply to the Newfoundland government because at that point, anybody from outside of the province was not permitted to travel in. And her request was rejected. And when it came before the courts, that judge found that there wasn't even a violation of freedom of movement because of public health objectives. And then, of course, later in the pandemic, we had some very countrywide sweeping movement issues when people who were unvaccinated were barred from traveling on trains or planes or any federally regulated travel. So the implications on freedom of movement was one of the immediate areas where we saw rights being implicated, and it continued right through the pandemic and right through the country in many other cases as well. And I know freedom of assembly was also another fundamental freedom that was very badly mangled throughout the pandemic. What are some examples of that?
Yeah, so freedom of assembly is a really interesting right. It's what scholars often refer to as a forgotten freedom because it's very rarely considered as a standalone right. It's often treated as a second order right to something like freedom of expression or freedom of religion. So the courts kind of have taken one or of two approaches. They either treat it as this second order right and say, do all of their analysis about a assembly restriction through the lens of religion or expression, like a protest, for example, or they treat it as a standalone right. And from a rights protecting perspective, my preference, and I think your preference, would be to treat it as a standalone right. Yeah. And after all, if we look at the actual text of our Constitution, it explicitly says it protects a peaceful assembly. It doesn't say anything about this being secondary to some other right. And I think that there was an opportunity for the courts here to develop a test about how to analyze and assess when freedom of assembly is engaged. Because I don't think before the pandemic, any Canadian or any court had considered the possibility that a government might ban summer barbecues or baby birthday parties or Christmas dinners. That just had not really entered the realm of possibility. But of course, as we know, in totalitarian states, assemblies are limited because assemblies don't, these purely social gatherings can, if they're anything like my Christmas dinner or my Thanksgiving dinner, they can pretty quickly devolve or evolve, depending on your perspective, into a discussion of politics. And I think that during the pandemic, when there were restrictions in place about gatherings, if you had some sort of unsanctioned gathering and maybe you were a person over the limit, that could be perceived itself as a subversive political act. So I think that the courts had an opportunity here to consider freedom of assembly, freedom of peaceful assembly, as something that also protected social gatherings, because That's a really novel issue.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, the courts chose to take this approach of treating it as a second order right. And there was a case that we describe in our book from Newfoundland called Kohler, where the court pretty explicitly said it's a second order right.
Yeah.
It's only protecting, assembly only protects expressive or religious gatherings. Now we've got to go to commercial break, but we will be right back.